Good evening, my holy brothers and sisters. How are we holding up? Today I had the privilege, and the great pleasure of looking up an old friend. You know, there was a little bit of an email thread, and somebody mentioned my friend, my good friend, Michael Lerner, who starred in our film, When Do We Eat? You may have seen When Do We Eat. This is the time of year to watch it. It's our movie about a Pesach Seder, and Michael plays the father. He's the star. And I hadn't spoken to him in years, and it was just so great to catch up. And I really encourage, this is just the time to do that. There's so many people that you haven't spoken to in years and who would love to hear from you. It means so much to them that you were thinking of them, that you picked up the phone, that you reached out. I mean, it's never been so easy to do like a thoroughly good thing. Just reach out across virtual space, virtual time, through the electronic ether, and reach out to somebody who would like to hear from you, right? Who's stuck at home alone, and it's a time to do it. And Michael Lerner is hilarious. It was so much fun to have a chat with him, and I highly recommend you watch When Do We Eat? It's our comedy about Passover. Nina and I wrote it, I directed. It's been a few years, but it's become a classic and people watch it every year. Okay, we're gonna count the Ohmer in one moment, but let us dedicate tonight's learning to Rav Chaim Menachem ben Leah. He's in Jerusalem. He's the founder of Breslov Research Institute. He's a great and gifted rabbi. He's taught so many people so much good stuff. He has COVID-19. He was out of the woods. He was in the hospital. He was sent home, and we just got the email that he's back in. So he really needs our prayers. Please God, may Rav Chaim Menachem ben Leah and everybody who is sick with this plague, may they get a complete and speedy healing, the healing that they need, and may they get that healing now. May they get that healing now. And we dedicate tonight's learning here at Accidental Talmud is Daily, AT Daily, to Rav Chaim Menachem ben Leah and his full and speedy recovery. We are in the Ohmer. Last night, I'm not going to say what we're going to count tonight because then we would have counted. Last night, we counted 3 nights, the third night of the Ohmer, and now we're going to count for tonight. So, I am prepared and ready to fulfill the positive commandment of counting the Ohmer. As is written in the Torah, you shall count 7 complete weeks from the day following the Pesach rest day, when you brought the Ohmer as a wave offering, to the day after the 7th week. You shall count 50 days. Then you shall present a meal offering of new grain to the Lord. May the pleasantness of the Lord our God be upon us. Establish for us the work of our hands. Establish the work of our hands. I'm going to say it in English first. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has made us holy through his commandments and has commanded us about counting the Ohmer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al sefiras haOhmer. Today is the 4th day of the Ohmer. That is 0 weeks and 4 days. May it be your will that I correct any blemish that I may have caused in these aspects of your manifestations here on earth. Netzach shebehesed, the idea of endurance and victory associated with loving kindness. May I step up and be a mensch and be there for other people and correct what I'm working on this year so that I will break free of my Pharaoh and be, somebody who can deliver more for others as I'm trying to do. And help me out, my dear friends, by saying Amen. We say Amen. Okay, let's get to our Talmud learning. That's what we're doing here. We are on page 37, Shabbos 37, in Tractate Shabbos, page 37. We're in chapter 3, and we're looking at the first Mishnah, which we opened yesterday. We were talking about it. The Mishnah basically says, and let me just get this picture here. This sort of helps you. We're talking about a stove. We're talking about cooking, right? So now in chapter 3, we're going to be talking about the laws of cooking prior to Shabbos, because we can't cook on Shabbos. So how much of the cooking has to be done before Shabbos begins? And now that we made hot food and we want to serve a nice hot dinner Friday night, but the guests didn't arrive right as Shabbos began. We didn't sit down immediately right when Shabbos began. So we want the food to stay warm. That's what we're really talking about. And you got to picture not, your stove with burners or electric coils like we have in the modern time, but in the ancient world, a stove. So this picture actually helps us imagine that a little bit, right? There we go. So that's a stove, like an ancient stove. And so the fire goes in that area. This is actually a half stove. But the idea is that you light a fire underneath it with some kind of fuel, and there's that hole, and you put a pot, some kind of a pot on top of that hole. So what can we do with our pot to keep the food warm after Shabbat begins? That's what we're talking about. In the Mishnah, it said, if we put rakings, right, or reeds, in other words, some kind of hay or dried grass as the fuel in the stove, so then we don't have to worry about it because for sure that went out, right? It can only burn for so long. After a few minutes, that stuff is gone. If there's any residual heat in the clay stove, right, this is made out of stone or clay, so that's okay because we're not concerned that the amount of heat that's just in the stone is really going to cook the food, and we're not concerned that the fuel which is inside, that it has coals, that we're going to come to stir the coals and possibly reignite some, or make some ignite that hadn't already lit. So that's with like a fast burning fuel. Then the issue is a slow burning fuel, right? If it's a slow burning fuel like wood, or what they're calling pumice, right, which is a fuel that they made from seeds and some other materials that could burn for a much longer time, so then it's a little less clear, right? So it seems that in our Mishnah, we're learning that if you use that slower burning fuel, so you can't leave your pot on it because it's going to keep cooking and it's going to keep heating, and you might be cooking on Shabbos. If you take the pot off it, you can't put it back. But if you sweep out the coals, or you add ashes on top of the coals, then you have some leeway, right? If you put a bunch of ash on top of the coals, so some heat will be in the stove, but because you already put a bunch of ashes on it, we're not worried that you're going to go in there and stir up the coals to try to get more heat, because you've already reminded yourself, you've made it clear that this thing can't keep burning. We're not trying to keep that fire going into Shabbos. We're just letting it be a little bit of a source of warmth, right? So if you swept out the coals or you put ashes on top of the coals, then it appears that according to Beis Shammai, you can leave water that was already heated on the stove, right? If you take it off, you can't put it back on. According to Beis Hillel, and the law usually follows Beis Hillel, if you had that slower burning fuel, but you swept out the coals or you put ashes on the coals, then you can leave not only hot water on the stove, but even cooked food. And not only can you remove it, but you could even replace it. If you took it off, you can put it back onto that stove, which is a little bit warm, right? It's going to help the food stay a little bit warm so that it's still warm when you get to dinner time, right? So that seems to be the law according to the Mishnah. Now, this is why there's an old saying, I didn't go to yeshiva, but I understand this is a saying in the yeshivas, that we don't paskin halacha from the Gemara, right? We don't paskin halacha from the Talmud, meaning if we only read that, well, then we'd think you can't make cholent, right? What is cholent? So cholent, it's something that is very traditional. This is like the most traditional Shabbos food. It's something that they make it on Friday, right? Usually the mom of the house makes it on Friday. She cooks the meat, right? The meat is basically browned and cooked. And she puts it in a pot with potatoes and onions and barley and some other vegetables and stuff. right? And then it's left to continue cooking all through Shabbos, and it's not ready to eat until lunchtime on Saturday. But according to what we just read in the Mishnah, that seems impossible. You can't do that, right? You can't leave something cooking. The most you can do is just have a kind of a warm stove, right? And you have to like cover up the coals that are under it or sweep them out just so that you could leave a pot of food that's already cooked on it, or water that's already boiled, that it could stay warm. So what's going on here, right? That's why we understand that in the Talmud, what we've got in the Talmud is a record of arguments that went back and forth between sages across generations, right? And sometimes the law didn't get fixed till much later, till later generations, right? And so we have to be very careful when we're just reading one page, like, does this have the law or not? This is why I really like the Koran, right? So I like to use the Koran for teaching you. I love the Art Scroll. The Art Scroll Talmud has more commentary, more sources. It's more complete. There's just more in there with more different opinions, not only from the Talmudic time, but medieval times and more recent than medieval. There's more opinions in there over that whole history of the oral law. But what the Art Scroll doesn't always have is, on a particular question that we're discussing in the Talmud, where did the law ultimately come out? What is the halacha that we follow today? And so that's a nice feature that you see here. You see there it says halacha in the margin. So when there's a question, right, I know this is not focused very well, but it just tells you where the law ended up. And that's an important feature of the Koran Talmud. So the law didn't end up that we're not allowed to leave food that's going to continue cooking on the stove. However, it's very particular situation where we can do that, right? It's very limited. Yes, we can make a cholent, but we have to understand how we arrived at the law of making the cholent so that we understand some of the limitations on making the cholent. Because here's the two things that we cannot do on Shabbat. We cannot cook food on Shabbat, right? We can't sit there in the kitchen and cook food, like where we start with ingredients and cook a meal on Shabbat. Cannot do that, my friends. No cooking allowed on Shabbos. And we cannot kindle a fire, nor extinguish a fire, right? So what that leads to is we have to be very, very careful that we don't stir coals within a fire, like a stove that's a wood-burning stove, right? A wood-burning stove, we can't go in there, or a coal-burning stove. We can't go in there and stir those coals to get them hotter so that they can do more of what we want in terms of adding heat to the food. No, we cannot do that. And with a gas oven, right, or a gas stove, we cannot adjust those burners. If something is left on for Shabbos under these very limited circumstances, we're not going to explore all of them, but just understand this principle. We cannot change the temperature of something that we have created for Shabbos. There's something called a blech, right? Nowadays we have an electric blech. We use this all the time on Shabbos. What is it? It's a hot plate, right? So it's a large hot plate that we have in our kitchen. It does not cook food. It just adds enough heat so that cooked food can stay warm, right? And with an electric blech, that's very reliable. Like we know how that's going to work. It's not going to get too hot. It's just going to be the right temperature. There's no danger of cooking food. We know that we can't turn it on and off, and we must not come to turn it on and off. That's electric blech, right? In earlier generations, that wasn't possible. 150 years ago, there's no electric blech. But what they had, they did have burners, they did have a stove, even with gas burners, and they would put like an iron sheet across it, right? And so with the burners on low, and they understood they might even take the knobs off the burners so that they could not change the temperature of the burners. That's where we're headed. Let's see if we can understand a little bit of how that argument proceeded among the sages even before it reached the later commentators. Okay. Right. So we understand that the underlying issue is we can't cook on Shabbat and we cannot come to stir the coals because we might violate kindling fire or extinguishing fire on Shabbat. So we understand like what we learned from the Mishnah, right? According to the Mishnah, both Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, they wouldn't let you have a stove that you ignited on Friday and that you let it keep burning and that there would be a pot on it, right? Because there's too much fear that you might adjust those coals. So the only way that you could use the warmth of that stove is if you swept out the coals or you put ashes on the coals. In trying to understand that, though, our sages bring in a few more cases, right? That was in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah closed around the year 200 of the Common Era. That's when it was redacted, and that's when it reached its final form. But the Talmud, the Gemara, right, the Gemara on the Mishnah, that closed about 500 years later. So over the next 500 years, from like 200 to 600, 700, they kept arguing about it, and they looked at some other cases that were related. They looked at, well, first of all, is there a difference if you place it in the stove, right? So that's more akin to the oven. So understand, for them, the stove was just this area, right, that had the coals in it, and then the pot would be on top of that stove area, made out of stone, made out of clay. Okay, so there's a difference if you put the pot in amongst the coals. So that already is a different case, and we understand that because now you put the pot in there, more dangerous. You certainly might come to move the coals that are in there, and the heat is more concentrated. It could lead to cooking the food. But then we said, okay, what about a stove where you've got two stoves that are joined with a stone wall in between them, and on one side you swept out the coals or put ashes on them, right? The other side is still burning. Can you put a pot on the side where you swept out the coals? We know that you can do that, right? You can do on a stove where you swept out or poured ashes on the coals. But does it matter that there's an adjoining stove where the heat is still going, right? And our sages conclude there, well, it seems like you can do that the heat coming over from the other side is not significant enough. And so that was sort of like one of the first openings into this law. And then they asked, well, what if you just lean your pot against the stove? You're not putting it inside, you're not putting it on top. But this thing is hot, and you're putting the pot on the side. So some of the sages say, no, you can't do that. You're trying to find a loophole to get around it. You can only lean against it if you've swept out the coals or put ash on top of them. You're not going to get around that law. But then our sages said, but wait a minute. Didn't we learn in an earlier Mishnah that on the eve of Shabbos, right, on Erev Shabbos, on Friday afternoon, you could put bread to make your challah in the oven as long as, while it was still day, it formed the crust, right? So it formed the crust, so it was significantly cooked, but it's not done. Right? It formed the crust. Does that mean it's done? Maybe there's still some more cooking that's going to go on in that bread. So if that's possible, why is it that we can't leave food that is cooked, right? You can't be cooking on Shabbos, but if the food is cooked, why can't you just leave it there in a way that it's going to stay warm? We also learned previously that you can start food as long, you can put cooked food on the stove and leave it there as long as it's cooked at least as much as the way Ben Drossai would eat it. Who was Ben Drossai? A thief, a bandit, a guy who was always on the run, a fugitive from justice. And so there what we were being taught is, okay, as long as it's cooked enough that people would eat it, so it's cooked. Okay, that food, as long as you cooked it before Shabbos began, now you can eat it and you can leave it on the stove. So this seems to contradict what we learned in our Mishnah. So how does that work? And what we come to understand is that the sages here were being very careful that we want to have a fence around the Torah. We want to make sure that people don't come to sin because they don't understand the principle and they have to make it basic enough that everyone's going to follow the same law and not get in trouble. And yet, even in Talmudic times, we're going to learn they debated this. They didn't have it all nailed down, right? So let me just get in front of me. Okay, so here we have, let me just make sure I'm in the right place. Okay. So we learned that with the bread, it was possible. So then Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda said, that Rabbi Yochanan said, with regard to a stove that was lit with a slow-burning fuel, pomace, here it's spelled pomace, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, P-O-M-A-C-E, or with wood, on Shabbat Eve, meaning Friday afternoon, one may leave a cooked dish that was already completely cooked, but then we define completely cooked means like you can eat it, but you can still add to the cooking. It can still cook a little more. It's just that it's basically cooked, right? As well as hot water that was already completely heated upon the stove, even if the type of food that when left for a prolonged period of time on the fire shrivels and improves. There is no concern lest one come to stoke the coals. The Gemara relates that one of the sages said to Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, isn't it Rav and Shmuel who both say, contrary to your opinion, that if food shrivels and improves when placed on the stove, leaving it there on Shabbos is prohibited? So Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda answers to him and says, is that to say that I don't know, that Rav Yosef said, that Rav Yehuda said, that Shmuel said, if food shrivels and improves when left on the fire for an extended period, it is prohibited to leave it there, right? Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda says, I know that Shmuel prohibits, right? And Rav and Shmuel argued with each other. They were usually on opposite sides of halakhic questions. But in this, Rav and Shmuel agree. So how can you say that this is permitted when both of them say it's prohibited, right? And so Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda says, I know they both said it's prohibited. I get that. When I said to you that it is permitted to leave it, I said it in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, because Rav Ukva from Meshan said to Rav Ashi, you who are close to the place where Rav and Shmuel lived, act in accordance with the ruling of Rav and Shmuel. We will act in accordance with the ruling of Rabbi Yochanan. So it was Rabbi Yochanan who came and said, you know what? We're not concerned that if you leave something that's basically already cooked and in such a way that you understand you cannot add fuel to the fire that's there, you can't stir it, but we think the people get it. Right? The people get it that they're not going to come to violate that law. And so Rabbi Yochanan permits this, right? Rabbi Yochanan permits. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, what is the ruling with regard to leaving food on the stove from Shabbat Eve? Rav Yosef said to him, didn't they leave food for Rav Yehuda and he ate it? Apparently it is permitted to do so. Abaye said to him, no proof can be brought from that. Not from Rav Yehuda, because he is in danger. Rav Yehuda needs to eat hot food on Shabbos. So for him, they could cook food. You can violate food if somebody's life would be in danger if they didn't eat cooked food. So we can't learn anything from the case of Rav Yehuda. Since he is in danger, as he is sick and needs hot food, even on Shabbat as well, it is permitted to heat up food for him. However, for me and you, as well as for other people, what is the ruling? Rav Yosef said to Abaye, in Surah, they leave food on the stove from Shabbat Eve, as Rav Nachman Bar Yitzhak from Surah was a master of good deeds, who was meticulous in his performance of mitzvahs, and they would leave food for him and he would eat it. Rav Ashi said, I stood before Rav Huna and saw that they left fish fried in oil for him atop the stove on Shabbat, and he ate the fish on Shabbat. And I do not know if his reason for doing so is that because he holds that it is permitted to leave food that shrivels and improves when left on the stove for a long time, or if it is because this dish has flour in it and therefore it shrivels and deteriorates. So now they're making a distinction. Well, maybe it's just food. You can leave it on the stove. If you're not making it better by leaving it on the stove, in fact, you understand that it's going to get worse. So it wouldn't be your intention to leave it there so that it keeps cooking. But that's not it, right? We are allowed to leave food that improves as long as we do it within this narrow quarter where there's not going to be a chance that we're going to blow it. And so here in the halacha note in the margin of the Koran, what does it say? A stove that was lit with pumice or with wood, one may leave. One may place a pot of cooked food on Shabbat Eve on a stove that was lit with the slow-burning fuel of pumice or wood, even if the coals were not swept or covered with ashes, as long as the food does not shrivel and taste does not improve. The taste does not improve, but the taste does improve. But what we're saying is the taste does not improve sufficiently that it makes a difference. The food has to be basically cooked before Shabbos begins. That is important, right? I want to just get it right. Ooh. Yeah, so on 38, we're going to continue understanding this question. Bottom line is, we can make cholent, right? All the moms that have been making cholent for hundreds of years, right? In the European tradition, they're not violating Shabbos, right? But the key is, understand, they basically already cooked the food on Friday, and they're going to leave it on a pot, on a stove, or in an oven that's going to be hot, but in such a way that there's no way they're going to come and adjust the temperature, or they're going to use the slow cooker, right? You guys, some people use the slow cooker. It has to be a slow cooker that you cannot come along and change the temperature from high to low or low to high. No, you cannot be doing that. If you use a black, right, you can put it on that hot black, but you can't be changing the temperature of the black. You can't be plugging the black in and out. A timer you can use. They didn't used to have that. We have that. You can't adjust the temperature. The food has to basically be cooked already. It took a long time for the law to sort of work its way out. And even in the times of the Talmud, in some places they would not allow this, and in some places they did. If you're not sure what you can cook and how much warmer it can be made, in what way you can keep it warmed, you got to research the modern halacha on this. Ask your rabbi. This is tricky. And I really do pray, before I teach this, I say, please God, keep me from making a mistake. And if I make a mistake, that no one should rely on my teaching and make a mistake and come to sin. This is tricky stuff, and it comes up all the time. We're talking about Shabbos cooking, right? But this is where we ended up. Cholent is legal, but we're very careful that we're not cooking on Shabbat or adding too much heat or going about our business of serving a warm dinner in a way that we will come to adjust the fire or do any kind of significant cooking itself on Shabbos. That is what I've got for us today. It is also my prayer, may it be your prayer as well, that everyone who is suffering from COVID-19 right now, that they get a complete and speedy recovery, particularly Rav Chaim Menachem ben Leah. May he have a complete and speedy recovery in Jerusalem. Tonight's learning was dedicated to him. Let me just check the comments here. Are there any questions that I need to look at? I haven't seen anything. Ooh, it's weird, like they weren't rolling in. I wasn't seeing them as they were coming in. Sandy Simon says, my mom would tell me stories when she was a young woman in London, England, on the way to the underground. On Friday night, she would take her cholent to the baker, and when they left the underground the next morning, after the bombings, they would pick up the cholent from the baker, right? And cholent, they actually use communal ovens in the little shtetls, right? In Eastern Europe, in Poland, 300-400 years ago, there were communal ovens, right? And so it was important that there was an eruv so they could carry it and they could bring it home and not violate carrying on Shabbos, which is what that's how we opened our study of Shabbos here in this tractate back in chapter 1. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Sending you all big love, and with God's help, we'll meet again and continue our learning tomorrow. All the best.